Welcome to the Thoughtful Gamer Podcast, Episode 4.
A New Hope. Sorry, we should redo that.
No, that was great. I love it. So today we're going to be talking about two of our favorite games, and by our I mean all three of us.
And by favorite you mean definitely in the top 50.
Yeah, both are in the top 50 games of all time. If you haven't heard it yet, I'm doing on the off weeks between this podcast a shorter podcast going down my top 50 games. One of them that we're going to be talking about today has already been mentioned. The games we're going to be talking about are two asymmetrical, thematic, two-player, I guess war games is the way to put it, based on incredible intellectual properties. We're talking about Star Wars Rebellion and War of the Ring, which is based on Lord of the Rings. But joining me today are two of our regulars here. We have Matt.
Hey.
He's diseased.
I am
plagued,
diseased.
Stricken.
I just want to open by saying that Star Wars is a lot simpler than you're trying to make it out. And at the heart of Star Wars, it's a struggle between good and evil.
Matt and I have been arguing all day via Twitter and the Slack chat about theoretical issues regarding the Force and the Jedi.
Star Wars offers so much room for interesting thoughts on the political level and the philosophical level, but at its very heart, it's a struggle of good versus evil. That's all the opinion I have on that right now.
If you want to hear more about this, look up my Twitter, because we message back and forth about 10 times. Anyway, Matt's here. My name's Marc, as always. It hasn't changed since last time. Also, we've got regular podcaster Orion.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Who's trying to sound sultry, apparently.
Let's say I'm succeeding.
I'm taken.
And we're going to be talking about these two games, which we all love. I'm going to preface the podcast with that. All three of us.
Yeah, when it gets nasty in the trenches, just remember that we all love these games.
Yes, but some of us love them more than others.
We all love both of these games. We all think they're amazing. But this entire week since the Top 50 podcast, they've been hounding me over and over because...
Spoilers, Mark.
Spoilers. Well, you should have... It went up already last week. Spoilers, Rebellion was my number 41, my 41st favorite game of all time, and Matt and Orion were outraged, just full of outrage about it. But I think
should be higher.
I think I can justify my position here. They have teamed up. I saw them. They were plotting their strategy against me in the Slack, but I could, I have access to it. But what they don't know is that I have been literally training my entire life for this kind of debate. It's a debate reference. I debated in high school. Anyway.
He's a huge geek, by the way.
I debated in high school and college. So what I want to do is I'm going to give a brief overview of each game in case you haven't played it, just so you can kind of understand the core mechanisms, and then we're going to dig really deep into these game mechanisms. I've written out a list for me of pros and cons for each of the games, so areas in which one might be better than the other, and then we can go from there and talk about why War of the Ring is the better of the two.
Spoilers, Mark.
That's not a spoiler. Anyway, let's talk about the games. So both of the games are, as I said before, asymmetrical two-player games focused on combat. Rebellion by Fantasy Flight. War of the Ring, I think, by Ares is the name of the publisher. Both of them have minis. They both have a lot of cards. War of the Ring, they both have a lot of dice rolling. But the core, I guess, conceit for both of the games is that they're trying to capture their intellectual properties kind of wholesale. Like, they're trying to get the essence of Lord of the Rings and Star Wars.
They're both very thematic games. So in War of the Ring, one of you is playing the Free People, and you have a vastly inferior army, and you're just racing to get Frodo to Mount Doom, where the Shadow People player just has the crushing armies and is trying to destroy all of Middle-earth before, Frodo reaches Mount Doom.
Yeah, so War of the Ring really highlights both the militaristic aspects of the Lord of the Rings story, but also on an equal level highlights the quest to destroy the ring in Mount Doom. So it's kind of played on two different levels.
Yeah, there's two simultaneous two-way victories. So if either player just conquers enough enemy fortresses, then they win. And if Frodo gets to the Mount Doom, he wins. Or if he's corrupted by the ring, then the Shadow player wins. But it tends to be that getting to Mount Doom for Frodo is the primary condition for the Free Peoples, and the military victory is the primary condition for the Shadow Peoples, just in terms of how most games will go.
Yeah, and it follows the book in that way, in that the Free Peoples don't really have a militaristic chance at it. So that's kind of the setup for it. The way it's played is both sides have these dice. They roll dice, which give them access to different types of actions. Both sides have cards that they can use to supplement their actions or give them additional types of actions.
Or enhance their combat.
All of the cards are dual use, so you can use them for their action or their improvements, or you can use them in combat to help boost your combat. And it's really centered around this dice rolling thing. They're custom dice, and they all have different sides to them, and you spend the dice to do that type of action. So if it comes up with a shield, that's the muster action. You can muster new troops. If it has the sword, that's a character action. You could do something with your characters, etc. Moving over to Rebellion, it also kind of tries to capture the original trilogy. Yeah, the original trilogy, kind of the main thrust, at least on a wide scale. Like, the Star Wars movies kind of have this big, galactic conflict, but they also have the familial conflict between Luke and Darth Vader. Rebellion really does the former. It doesn't really go into kind of the intimate parts of the Star Wars story. It's really about the Empire trying to find the hidden Rebel base. So at the beginning of the game, the Rebels are going to choose one of the systems on the player board in the universe. And there are probably 20 to 30 of them?
32 total systems, though 6 start under Imperial control.
Wow, Ryan's done the math.
He did the math.
There are exactly 32 systems. So it's all about trying to find this hidden Rebel base. At the beginning, the Rebels player is going to pick a system, and that's where the base is going to be. They can amass troops on the base, so it's put off to the side of the board where it just says Rebel base, but they're at wherever the base is. The Imperial player is just trying to spread his forces around and discover that base. Instead of using dice to kind of drive the action selection in Rebellion, you are mostly using you're entirely using cards, essentially. So you have these
you're assigning your leaders to different types of actions, so they can either move your fleets around the board or they can perform these mission cards.
Yeah, so instead of having dice that grant you kind of your basic actions, each player has 4 basic action cards which will never leave their possession. And then in both games, you draw additional cards that provide unique actions. So in that sense, they're fairly similar. The main difference, I think, is kind of in the overall objective. In War of the Ring, it's very militaristic. In Rebellion, it's more of a hide-and-seek kind of game. It's a little bit more cat and mouse. It's not quite as straight. It's really just about finding that base.
So I don't think you've talked about the track in Rebellion. There's kind of a turn track. In every turn, the turn marker progresses. But from the other end of that track, there's a rebel marker. And as the Rebellion player completes certain objectives, the marker moves down from the other end of the timeline. So it's kind of simulating this. Can the Rebellion hold it out long enough so that their objectives meet the timeline, and that's their win condition?
Yeah, I was actually just about to talk about that because going into the pros I see of Rebellion, that's absolutely my favorite mechanism in the game. It's a candle burning at both ends. You have time actually progressing as you go through the rounds of the game, but the length of the game is shortened as the Rebellion completes their objectives, which I think is a fantastic way to do things, because if the Rebellion does well, it puts a lot of pressure on the Imperials.
Thematically, this is captured by the rebels stirring up unrest throughout the galaxy against the oppression of the Empire. So as if the Empire waits too long to snuff out the Rebellion, eventually the entire galaxy rises against them and the Rebellion succeeds. on the political scale that this game is primarily concerned with.
Yeah, so a lot of those deal with either loyalty of having a lot of rebel loyalty in a sector, or scoring military victories, which aren't easy to come by, or big kind of thematic events like destroying the Death Star.
Yeah, it's really kind of a measure of galactic support for the rebel cause. Or at least it's like a PR thing, right? If you blow up the Death Star, people are going to support your cause more. You get more, it seems more hopeful, and that just shortens the leash on the Empire. I would love to see more games use this kind of thing where actions can change the end condition of the game, and how well one side is doing can change the end condition, because I think it's a really neat way of measuring progress, I guess, by one of the players.
Right, you can kind of see the Imperial's progress on the board because they'll be building tons of fleets and moving around and exploring all these different worlds, while the Rebellion's progress is primarily measured in shortening the length of the game.
Yeah, and it's really cool.
These like small victories that the rebels win, which is so thematic. Whereas when you look at the board, you're like, oh, there are Imperial ships everywhere. These big, massive triangles, and there's a Death Star, and there's an AT-AT.
Yeah, and it really, now that I think about it, it really models kind of real-world rebellions or protests, right? That, if you have like an oppressive government, like it's very noticeable, and in this game, it's very noticeable on the board visually. It looks like the Empire is being oppressive, but the agents of change in the rebellion is kind of behind the scenes, just like in real life, until they achieve, until they build up enough support to kind of, overthrow the government or create change. And so in that sense, it has a really cool visual aspect to it. In a more gamey strategic sense, it also plays into how the game's going to be once you've played it a bunch of times, because the objective deck is only 15 cards, I think. So once the Imperial player knows that objective deck, it adds a new dimension to the game of trying to not only progress your goals and find the rebel base, but avoiding means for the rebel to get their objectives.
Right. I think that's super interesting in the game. Orion and I played just a little bit ago, and for example, I got to deploy some big capital ships. So I had a Mon Calamari cruiser and a Carillion corvette. I placed them down in a system right next to one of his fleets. Now, if he knew that I was holding the objective card that says play after you destroy an Imperial Star Destroyer, then he might have to make the decision to pull out of that sector. So that's an interesting thing to have in the balance of, does he just go in and try to plow through me, risk me moving the objective down, or does he pull out?
Yeah, and so I think both of these games have this kind of thing with knowing the cards improves the game. And that's some of my favorite things in a game in general, is that the experience gets richer and deeper as you gain more knowledge of the game. I think that's the sign of a truly great game, is when that's just part of the experience.
Yeah. I want to say, first off, that it's really fun to play the first time. I think both games, but especially Rebellion, which is on the mind, it's really fun to play the first time because you get all these thematic cards and you're like, oh, I see what that does. That's like totally this moment from episode 5.
From a strategic perspective, it definitely gets deeper as you start understanding what your opponent's trying to achieve, and then watching what moves they make. And you can really start predicting what they're going for, and then you set up your counters to that. And then you start playing off each other in this. There's a lot of bluffing in, because you set out what missions you're going to do face down with a leader, and based on what skills that leader has, you might be able to predict, oh, that's probably a sabotage mission, let me prepare for that. Or they're probably trying to capture my rebel leader, so maybe I don't want to go try to infiltrate this turn.
Yeah, and that actually segues perfectly into one of my other pros of Rebellion, is that you have this kind of mini bluffing game with how you assign your leaders. So how it works is that, who assigns first? The Empire?
The Rebellion.
The Rebellion, that's right. So you have these leaders, and they each have these different skill symbols on them. And when you have these action cards in your hand, they require a leader to accompany them of particular skill types. So if you have like Boba Fett, he's really good with the attack. It's like a fist, the symbol. Attacking, violent.
I think it's called Spec Ops in the game.
Oh, really? They give it a fancy name?
Something like that.
Anyway, he's really good at that, so when he's assigned to a card, you know it's probably going to be something violent and aggressive because that's his main skill contribution. So part of the game is, as the Rebellion, when you're assigning cards and your actions, you're kind of giving the Imperials information that they can then use to make their decision when they assign next. Because any of the leaders that you don't assign to an action card can be used to move ships, or they can be used to oppose your opponent's action. So anytime an action is played, if it's some of the actions just resolve automatically, but a lot of them you attempt the action in a system, and if the opponent has a leader of the appropriate skill type, they can send that leader into that system as well and oppose it, and then maybe it doesn't happen at all. So it creates this interesting bluffing and positioning dynamic, particularly with the rebels, I think, and trying to see how many actions they can get away with without leaving themselves exposed to not being able to oppose an important action on the other side, or not being able to move their ships when they want to.
Yeah. Furthermore, you don't have to play all the actions that you assigned at the beginning. So, for example, Boba Fett, you mentioned, has those 3 fists. One of the Imperial's standard mission cards is a capture. So when Orion was putting down Boba Fett on a mission card face down, the whole round, I'm looking at that. He hasn't played that mission yet. I'm thinking, that's probably the capture. And so I'm questioning whether I'm actually going to do my missions because I don't want to put one of my guys in harm's way.
Yeah, and I think that's a really neat mechanism. It creates a little mini game within the game as a whole of seeing what leaders you're exposing and what the implications of that may be. Another thing I wanted to talk about in terms of things I like a lot about Rebellion is the probe deck. So again, the main thrust of the game is the Empire's trying to find this hidden base of the rebels, and how they do that is not only just visiting different systems, but throughout the game they'll have the opportunity at the end of each round and with certain cards to look at cards from the probe deck. And the probe deck is just one card for each system on the map. So as they see more cards from the probe deck, they see which systems are not the rebel base, because the rebel base card is set aside. And that helps them kind of close the net. I think it's just a really elegant way of doing that kind of hide and seek game.
Yeah, and it's all hidden from the Rebellion player. He doesn't know which systems the Imperials have already probed.
The other 2 pros I gave for Rebellion were that the minis are just great. They look so good, especially the Super Star Destroyers and the Death Star under construction minis.
Yeah.
They're so good. Although those are the 2 least used minis, I think, in the game. But they look awesome anyway. The other aspect of the game that I really enjoy is some of the narrative aspects of the cards. Now, I'm going to say I think in terms of like the narrative aspect of the game, War of the Ring does it a bit better with their cards. But I particularly like the projects deck, which is something the Imperial has access to, which lets them pursue really big projects like constructing the second Death Star or constructing a Super Star Destroyer. Things like that I think is really cool because it's something they can choose to pursue or not. You can go through the whole game pretty much ignoring it if you wanted to. The other thing is the ability to capture the rebel leaders, I think, is really fun. And it can create some interesting narratives. Like one game with Orion, I think, who did you convert? Or was that me? Was I the Imperials?
I thought I converted Luke one game. Didn't I?
Yeah, you did.
Oh, really?
Dark Side Luke.
I don't think that was me, though. It might have been Leia with me.
Oh, maybe it was. Yeah. This game we just played, I converted Jan Dodonna to the dark side. So that gives me an extra leader and removes one from the rebels.
Yeah, so the fact that you can capture people and then interrogate them or convert them to the dark side.
Guys, I want to see
and then if Han and Chewie come into the game with the Millennium Falcon, they're really good at rescuing the leaders.
Yeah.
Like, that entire thing is just really fun.
Yeah. Guys, I want to see an alternate episode 6 where Leia was converted to the dark side between episodes 5 and 6.
Okay.
The Imperials have a lot of cards that let them take actions based on having captured a leader. A lot of them will give them additional information on where the base is or what objectives the rebel player has, or in the extreme example, convert them to the dark side.
And this just reminded me that these are two games that are in this little subgenre that I think I enjoy a lot, of like alternate history games.
Yeah.
They're just alternate histories in a fictional universe. So we have a couple of war games that are kind of in this genre, like Triumph and Tragedy. You can kind of play out World War II a bit differently.
Yeah.
We just got and played for the first time Labyrinth, the War on Terror, where you can play out the War on Terror, you know, starting after in September 2001.
Twilight Struggle, of course.
Yeah, Twilight Struggle, weird. Although I don't feel it as much in Twilight Struggle. It's a lot. Twilight Struggle is a little bit more abstracted, I guess.
Yeah, I still think it's there, but it's not the main point of the game, whereas you see it much more in some of the other ones.
Regardless, I love this kind of subgenre where
it's like,
they give you the pieces of what happened in the history, fictional or not, but they just play out in a different way, or they can be played in a different way.
Yeah, it's like, here is this awesome universe or this awesome place and time in history. We'll start it right at a certain point and then just go. And you get to play out the consequences of all of the interesting things in that world.
Yeah, like in Star Wars, you know, Leia's captured and interrogated in Star Wars Rebellion. Someone could be captured, someone could be interrogated. It gives you the pieces, but the actual story and narrative plays out uniquely each time.
I have a comment on the thematicness of the cards. I think a difference between the two games, if it's okay for me to talk about differences, is that War of the Rings thematic cards are much more precisely thematic. So,
yes.
So you'll play a card and it'll have to deal with, say it deals with Elrond and the elves, and it will tell you to recruit elven units in these specific two places. Whereas in Rebellion, they're more high-level thematic. So a certain card will invoke a certain moment that you remember from the movies, like a sabotage, for example. But it plays out wherever you want.
I would agree with that, especially the missions where a specific character has a bonus tend to be more thematic in Rebellion, I think. So the one I'm currently thinking of is the Uprising, where Han gets a bonus, and it's the art on it is the Endor infiltration, where he goes in there, and he's especially good at that.
Yeah, I was thinking of that card, Lead the Strike Team. And it doesn't have to take place on Endor, but basically it gives you you can just bring in some ground units and have a ground battle ignoring the space battle with Han at the helm.
Right.
But it could happen anywhere, on any planet.
Technically, Matt, it's the moon of Endor.
Did I say the planet of Endor?
You did say Endor.
I apologize. It could happen
We're better nerds than this. Come on.
Look, Endor right there. It could happen on the planet of Endor in this game.
Yeah, I think the maps... I think Endor is supposed to be a gas planet, right?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, they're showing the moon of Endor on there.
All right, I apologize.
I thought you would fight me on that, but you're like really contrite.
Please don't revoke my nerd card.
That actually kind of leads into one of the cons I had for Rebellion, is that I think because it's more open, more sandboxy, it detracts from the thematicness of the game a bit compared to War of the Ring. It's still exceptionally thematic, but because it's so open and the actions are a bit broader, it doesn't provide necessarily the same arc, the same narrative arc, in kind of the same structure as the Star Wars movies, whereas in War of the Ring, you're essentially always going to have the same story arc.
I would put that in a more positive light, though. It is more sandboxy. It doesn't pigeon you into a particular thing. War of the Ring pigeons you into basically reenacting Lord of the Rings.
And I was thinking about this earlier. I think this might be the crux of our disagreement about it, because you guys both like Rebellion a little bit better, right? Maybe?
It'd be hard for me to choose. I like Rebellion more than you do, but I think they're both fantastic.
If I had to choose one, I would choose Rebellion.
Okay.
But I'm not sure I would choose one.
Sure.
That's where I am.
I think this might be the crux of it, though, because I love that in War of the Ring, you're going to be playing out that same really tight, epic story arc where the Shadow Forces are going to be overwhelming. The Ring Bearer is going to be getting close to being corrupted. They make a last-ditch effort into Mordor as, the Free Peoples are being besieged on all sides. And then it's a matter of whether or not the Ring Bearer can destroy the ring in time. And each game is almost certainly going to take that form. And I love that. Although I can see why people might think that's a negative compared to the more open, free structure of Rebellion.
Yeah, and before we go on and talk about War of the Ring, I'm not sure that I fully agree that it leads to less thematic moments. They are more sandboxy. So when I lead the strike team and I take Han because I get a bonus playing that card with Han, even if it's on Bespin or Hoth, it still leads to this feeling of desperate battle. As the Rebellion, I'm always behind, but I can try with this hero, I can try this last-ditch effort to attack the planet's surface. And to me, that gives the thematic feel of Star Wars.
Yeah, let me throw something out there and see. Let me see if you guys will agree with it. Rebellion is really good at providing very thematic Star Wars feeling moments. War of the Ring is really good at making the entire game as a whole feel like the Lord of the Rings story.
I think I would probably agree with that. And I would go back to pointing out probably, I think the most interesting difference between Star Wars and Lord of the Rings is that in Star Wars, you're aware of the general backdrop of the galaxy, but you're really focused on these specific characters and what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve and the battles they're fighting and the struggles they're going through. Whereas in Lord of the Rings, you're following the Fellowship, of course, but there's a lot more of the world going on. And you see these battles of Minas Tirith or in Rohan or these different areas, and you have a little bit more of the overall world, maybe because Star Wars spans a galaxy and Lord of the Rings spans, a large country. But when you take that into the difference in these two games, Star Wars, with Rebellion, you have these individual missions which feel very thematic because they're related to a character or a specific moment from the movies, but you can move them to be any time and any place, whereas in War of the Ring, they're much more tied to the general history of what actually happened in the books, not necessarily exactly the same thing every time, but along the same sort of arc.
Yeah, that brings out another point that I think kind of helps explain why I find War of the Ring a bit better, is that it's more tied to a sense of place and a sense of geography.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Like the Rebellion board, you have all the planets and you recognize all or most of the names, but the planets are just statistics. Like there's little markers showing how beneficial they are. They're just...
But Mark...
It's just another ball with benefits.
Hyperspace, Mark.
Whereas in Lord of the Rings, like when, Saruman comes out of Orthanc and Rohan's trying to hold them in there, like you get the real sense of the Rohirrim and the oppression of Saruman in all the geography of it. You have Fangorn right there, which can be significant.
In all honesty, like I want to hang the War of the Ring board on my wall. It's like an awesome map of Middle Earth.
Yeah.
And that's definitely not the case with Rebellion. I mean, I think the board's fine, and it's cool to see all these planets that I'm familiar with.
It's a cool galaxy, and you're like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense how, Naboo's kind of off in this corner, and Utapau's way out in the edge, and that's why Grievous hid there, and things like that. But you have less of a tie to the worlds and the location than you do in Middle Earth.
Well, yeah, and then for obvious spatial reasons, all the planets are really close to each other physically on the board.
Yeah, so necessarily, War of the Ring is way more tied to specific place, both because of the geography and because of the technology. Like, it's still Frodo struggling to get to Mordor.
Sure.
Rather than, heroes with hyperdrives that can just go anywhere they want.
Right, and in Star Wars, most of the action takes place in corridors or rooms of some location, and then you'll get a zoom out shot of the planet or the Star Destroyer or whatever, but you don't see them riding across the countryside like you do in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess in that sense, they do model their stories.
Oh, I think they both capture their
but to me,
their universes.
I feel Lord of the Rings better in War of the Ring, just because it captures the entire story arc, and not only that, like small arcs, like I said, with Rohan trying to hang on and everything coming down into Minas Tirith, it captures a lot more of what I associate with Lord of the Rings, whereas Rebellion captures really good individual moments, but not necessarily the entire arc.
Rebellion's more about creating your own version of history, whereas Lord of the Rings is more about reenacting what happened.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, and part of this might be just the way that we experience these universes. To me, Lord of the Rings is more of an emotional connection. You know, it's more about the characters. Like, there's nothing in the board game that really simulates the feelings that Sam had for Frodo. And to me, that's one of the biggest experiences of Lord of the Rings. Whereas Star Wars, I've always experienced it more as a springboard for my imagination and these amazing worlds and amazing technologies and heroes. And then, you know, something happens, and then, you know, an exciting thing happens with those people. So for me, I feel like Rebellion actually models closer to its universe because, you know, War of the Ring can't capture that emotional side.
But I think it does, right? I think it does for two reasons. First, because the Fellowship whittles away as you progress throughout the game.
Yeah, but
you have to sacrifice people.
I played the Free Peoples of Middle-earth last time I played that game, and I sacrificed Gimli like it was no question at all.
Right, but to me that's a hard decision, and people are leaving the Fellowship, people are dying from the Fellowship, and you're trying to hang on there. And so you get that sense of the Fellowship disintegrating out of necessity, which is a key part of the Lord of the Rings story. But secondly, again, going back to the geography, like when you have to abandon Helm's Deep because, you know, it's lost and you have to retreat back to Gondor, or when the elves are holding on to a particular one of their locations, like you feel tied to the people and the locations more in Lord of the Rings. I guess because of the association with the story, but I think on a game level it does it a bit better.
We should probably talk about War of the Ring a little bit now.
Yeah, let me go over my last two cons real quick. I think the combat in Rebellion's a little bit too clunky. Like I feel like they could have streamlined it a bit better. That's a minor quibble. There's like 3 different die faces, and you can activate different abilities, and one of them's a critical and can go across types. There's 2 types of
I think it's fine.
Units. It's okay. It's not great. War of the Rings combat is closer to like an Axis and Ally system. It's just rolling high or low numbers. And
I find the leaders
getting
clunky in War of the Ring, honestly.
They're okay.
They're both fine. I think both combat systems are fine.
They're good enough. They don't detract from the game. I think I prefer the little bit more streamlined War of the Ring. And the second one, in Rebellion, it's the Imperials who progress the story of the game. Because basically, if both sides just sat there, the Rebels would win. Like, the Imperials have to be the instigators of the story, and the Rebels are the ones kind of being more passive about it. Whereas in War of the Ring, the Free Peoples have to be the instigators in terms of like getting the ring to Mount Doom. And that feels a little bit, it feels more desperate. In Rebellion, on the Rebel side, you don't feel as desperate, I think, because you have more of a passive role.
I mean, I'll give you that in War of the Ring, as the Free Peoples, you feel really desperate. I don't think that it's bad in Rebellion.
No, I wouldn't say it's bad.
It's not as spot on.
Well, again, Star Wars is completely following this group of, 3 to 5 rebel heroes, whereas Lord of the Rings, you're more aware of the world. Mm-hmm. And I think in Rebellion, the Imperial player is the one who's on the clock and has to push out and find the rebel base and force the rebels to move it or try to survive, and the rebel player is playing opportunistically and trying to find a little opportunity here or a chance there to slow down the Imperials or shorten the time. In War of the Ring, the shadow player is almost certainly going to win by military eventually, and it's up to the free peoples to really put a clock on them and force them to be concerned about the threat of the ring being destroyed. So in both cases, the rebels or the free people are putting a clock on, but the kind of the default state is that I would say the shadow peoples in War of the Ring will win eventually, whereas in Rebellion, the rebels will win eventually.
I'm not sure I agree with that, because the Imperials are going to search for the base. So yes, if the Imperials just did nothing, then the rebellion would win. But the inevitable creep of Imperial control is real in the game.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to some of this when we talk about strategy a little later.
Yeah, there's one final point about Rebellion that I don't want to talk about now, but I do want to come back to it at the end, because I think it explains this a bit better, and it might be my most important criticism of the game. But let's go over to the War of the Ring pros. Things I love most about the game: I love how there are dual victory conditions and dual storylines happening. You have the progression of the Fellowship in the Ring against the corruption of the Ring that the Shadow player is trying to push, and then you have the entire military aspect. And they complement each other, but it's very much two narratives happening, and I think that makes the game really engaging.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Spot on.
You also have to decide how to split your actions between the victory conditions, and especially as the free people, you have to commit to one of them early on, because you're not going to catch up if you spend too many actions on the other victory track, or victory kind of theme, I guess.
Yeah, and I can't imagine that was an easy game design problem to tackle, like the inherent dual nature of the story. And lesser designers probably would have focused on one or the other, and I think it's pretty remarkable how they managed to make both stories engaging and interesting and full of interesting decisions.
Yeah, totally. And I think we mentioned earlier, it feels like it normally will come down to, can Frodo get to the Crack of Doom, or will the forces of darkness sort of militaristically take over? That's kind of probably the most likely end game.
You can't fully commit to one. Like, maybe you go 80% on one and 20% on the other, but the free people have to be concerned about holding off their military as long as they can, and getting wins when they can, even if they're pushing the ring a lot, or maybe they try to establish a bigger military and move the ring a bit more slowly, but they have to balance it, and it makes really tough choices of how you're going to balance that.
I feel like it would be an okay game if it was just the military aspect.
Yeah, it'd be pretty good.
Which is really impressive, because it's not just about that. It has dual storylines on both sides, as you said.
Yeah. Another thing I like about the game is that it has this political system where, just like in the books, the elves and the dwarves and Gondor don't necessarily want to be part of this conflict until you show them that it's that serious, and that's modeled in the game where...
Well, they won't join the war, and you can't recruit any of their units until they get invaded.
Basically, or you're really good about sending Legolas or Gimli or Aragorn.
There's a few specific of the event cards that can change that, but otherwise that whole faction is almost inactive until they get invaded by the shadow player.
Yeah, and it's really frustrating as the free people, but it models the story so well, where the Fellowship and Gandalf and everyone involved there knows the importance of what's happening, but everyone else is just so belligerent about it until it's literally on their doorstep.
Yeah, I think the Rohirrim are the best example of that, because every game Saruman is gonna come through with his Uruk-hai, and you want to prepare. You want to prepare. We need to shore up Helm's Deep, but you can't until you go and convince them.
Yeah, it's so good. I know some people get frustrated by that, but I think that's the entire point.
Yeah,
it's supposed to be frustrating.
Well, yes, but I'll say here, it's not necessarily the most enjoyable game mechanic. And some of my criticisms of War of the Ring come down to, this is really thematic, but I don't really love it as a game. That's overstating it.
It can be really frustrating when you don't get to use the dwarves 3 out of 4 games because they're just never activated.
It's thematic.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
yeah,
a bit
thematic,
annoying because
sure.
they have the best minis too.
Yeah, the dwarf elites are just bigger dwarves. I love it.
It's great. They look awesome.
I'll also say the minis are not as good in War of the Ring.
Yeah,
They're
that's one of my cons I listed. The minis are not as good in War of the Ring. First of all, a lot of them look so similar that it's so hard to sort them.
Especially
And-
the free people's side, there's so
Yeah.
much crossover.
Yeah, and they bend real easily. Some of them are can barely stand up now just from normal, pretty careful use, I'd say. The minis just aren't as good, except for those dwarves, which look awesome. And
Dwarves
the
look
shadow,
pretty good.
the shadow
the
ones,
shadow,
like the trolls.
the
look
shadows
cool.
all look pretty good, and their elite units are all pretty sick.
Yeah, the Nazgul look
The
cool.
Olifants, the Nazgul,
Yeah.
the super trolls, and the wargs. They all look really good.
The artwork, on the other hand, is fantastic.
Oh,
Oh,
man,
yeah.
that map is so
The,
good.
the map,
The map is beautiful.
the character drawings,
Yeah.
the drawings on some of the cards.
I think it's all based on some of the art from the books, right?
Oh yeah, the
Some of
guy
the-
who illustrated the books way back.
I don't remember if
It is not
it's not the movie.
Jackson
Yeah.
movie-esque.
I don't know if it's directly pulled from that artwork or just inspired by it, but it looks really good. The final thing I want to say that just really stands out about War of the Ring to me is how oppressed you feel as the free people and how oppressive you feel as the shadow. The coolest thing is that whenever a unit dies on the free people side, you put them back in the box. You cannot use that mini for the rest of the game. Whereas the shadow, the shadow forces, if they die, you just cycle them back through. So you literally have a
Just spawn-
finite
Spawns
number.
more orcs.
Yeah, they just breed more orcs or whatever they do.
If you kill an elf, it's gone forever.
Yeah, and it feels so bad.
Oh,
and,
man.
and I think last time I played as the Free Peoples, I literally ran out of elves. They were just used up.
That is so tragic.
You feel so bad. No, not the elves.
They're not going to be able to go west.
Yeah, it's such a simple game design mechanism, but it's really impactful for how simple it is. All right, moving on to cons. The rulebook's awful for War of the Ring. It's really bad. It was way too difficult to learn this game. The setup time is annoying.
Also because of how similar the minis are.
Yeah, mostly because the minis all look identical on the Free People side. Both of the games have long setup times, but Rebellion's 5 to 10 minutes, and War of the Ring's 15 easy.
I mean, War of the Ring has the Axis and Allies thing of we'll set it up as it was at a certain moment in time. Whereas Rebellion has a little more freedom.
Rebellion's a bit more dynamic in the setup. War of the Ring has a set scenario.
And then the final thing is that what we already talked about is that the story is a bit more railroaded to where the same general kind of things are going to happen. In some sense, I wish there was a more open experience, but I think ultimately, if it came down to it, I would not choose that with War of the Ring, because I think at the end of the day, that's kind of a strength of it, is that we talked about the geography and feeling for the elves when they're wiped off the board, or seeing everything come down to the shadow forces almost every time just encircling Gondor. Reliving those moments and those story arcs is really it's really a nostalgic experience playing War of the Ring, to me at least. You're reliving the story and reliving your memories of that story.
Yeah.
And the specific details are different, but because the arc's the same, it becomes a nostalgic experience.
Yeah, it is. I'm not sure if it's any different in Rebellion, but War of the Ring definitely captures it.
I'd agree on War of the Ring except for one spot, and that's with the Fellowship. Because after 2 or 3 plays, they just become extra health points for Frodo. And there's no difference between Legolas or Gimli or Boromir. They all have exactly the same stats, and other than the mini being different, there's no functional difference between them. And so you're like, oh, I took 2 damage. Well, Gimli died this time. Oh, well. And there's nothing to relate that to in the books because, of course, most of the Fellowship doesn't die. It's really great when Boromir dies and sacrifices himself in some epic event, or in our last game, Merry got separated right in the middle of an orc army, so it was like he got carried off to Dol Guldur, but the rest of the deaths don't have the same impact, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do think the ring progression and the Fellowship progression's handled really well.
Oh, I agree.
It's a hair abstracted, and that's where...
It's probably the most abstracted part of the game.
Sure.
Which, going back to what I said about the emotional experience of Lord of the Rings being so important to me, I feel like that's where it's least like its universe.
I would agree with that. With kind of using the Fellowship as hit points, it takes away a bit. Yeah.
So let's talk real quick about how the Fellowship actually works, or how that the ring to Mordor endgame actually works. Your Fellowship starts in Rivendell, and you can basically expend a certain die point every round.
A certain action. Yeah.
A certain action to move the Fellowship one space. And there's a hidden mechanic so that it's moving in secret until discovered. But basically they have to move the number of spaces on the map to get to Mordor. When they get to Mordor, they reveal themselves in Mordor, and then there's a simple kind of 5-step track up through Mordor onto Mount Doom.
Yep.
So to me, this is one of the things that feels less thematic and more tedious, is that I have to play the most pragmatic path to Mordor. And it's not really what happened in the book.
It's close to it. Like the quickest routes through Moria, you go through the North Gate. That's from the book, right?
But we don't.
They go
it's
through.
been 15 years since I read the book.
No, you go through Moria, and then you go down through kind of the Badlands and the swamps, and then you go through Ithilien to Minas Morgul. I forget if that's one step closer or the same as the Black Gate.
Anyway, I end up getting lost more in the tedium of keeping track of how many spaces I've moved and making sure that I'm going the smallest number of spaces to Moria than thinking about what the Fellowship is doing. You know, compounded by the fact that the Fellowship is just health for Frodo. I do love when Frodo gets to Mordor, going up the mountain. The eye is ever present. The consequences are grave when the eye discovers Frodo. I mean, I think that feels desperate. It matches the story. I think that's really good.
I think the feeling of it is excellent, of you're trying to push the ring through, and it's hard because you're taking damage and people are dying and you're trying to get there, and once you get to Mordor, it's that much harder. But the mechanics don't quite evoke the same emotional response and feel more abstracted. So it's more a matter of counting to 10 spaces and seeing how much health you have left.
Sure, but you still get the feeling, right? You can't blame it much for being too abstracted when you're still feeling those things.
I'm coming in too argumentative. You do get the feeling.
You get
and I understand your point. It is a hair. I would have liked it a hair less abstracted.
You get the feeling of racing against the inevitability of the shadow armies and trying to push the Fellowship through, but each individual step doesn't have any meaning or any distinguishing factors from any other step, and any death in the Fellowship has no difference to any other death.
Correct. One thing they do well, though, is that if you do get revealed, you need to hide again as fast as possible, because there are so many cards on the shadow side that allow them to do very bad things if the Fellowship is revealed.
Yeah, and if the Fellowship is revealed, you have to decide on a path and count out, if you traveled 5 distance, you have to count out 5 distance, and at that point you have to decide which path you took, whether you took, the North Pass or through Moria, or if you went down through Rohan or whatever.
Yeah. I think what they could have done is just make each member of the Fellowship a little bit more distinct, or have a little bit more distinct special powers. That might fix the issue.
Yeah, or it's a little clunky of how you decide who your leader is. Like, one of your Fellowship members is face up on the top, and that's your leader. It starts with Gandalf until you lose Gandalf, and so on. Maybe something a little more thematic about the actual makeup of the party as it is. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know
It
what
would
the
it would
solution
it would
be.
have to add other mechanics, I think, which
Right.
might just muddy up the whole thing.
Right.
You know, we're quibbling on details here,
Yeah.
Definitely.
but this is the con part of the list, so that's our con.
Yeah. But yeah, I just like War of the Ring better. I don't mind that it's not as open. You don't have as many choices to deviate from the story. I think the detailed choices you make on a kind of a micro level that deviate are interesting and strategic enough to make it a good game, rather than just like it's not like, you know, it could have just been like a storytelling experience. It's not that at all. It's a legit strategy game.
Yeah, like the military aspect as the free peoples, you're still always trying to recruit and position yourself in the best way to slow down Moria. And you know that you're probably not going to stop them, but you can slow down them to give Frodo a fighting chance.
Right, yeah. And another note it hits, like you just said, is that towards the last, you know, quarter of the game, it really feels like everyone has grouped together and they're like, okay, we're deciding the fate of Middle-earth here. We're going to stand as long as we can. We've run out of all other options. And then it's just a matter of, is the ring destroyed or not? And I think that's a great feeling, especially when you can look over at your pile of units you no longer have. They've died permanently. You can see, like, even just the visual of, like, the minis for the Shadow Army are red. They look really violent. They're bigger generally. It really gets the aesthetic of being oppressed by this massive, inhuman force.
Do you want to give your final con on Rebellion, or should I give a con on War of the Ring?
You do yours first.
Okay, so here's a con in comparison. I find that I enjoy the turn in Rebellion a little bit more than the turn playing in War of the Ring. So in War of the Ring, you roll your die, and they have different action symbols on them. So basically, you can do the actions that you get on your die, and then you go back and forth performing actions. And they're usually like play a card of a certain type, move, or do the fellowship thing if you're the fellowship. But the most complicated thing is the cards are all pretty detailed. Like I mentioned earlier, they're more specifically thematic. And so sometimes the consequences of playing a card aren't as apparent. I have to read them. So, as a longtime sufferer of analysis paralysis, in War of the Rings, I find myself going through all my options a lot, feeling like I'm not quite ready to make a plan of what I'm going to do in my turn. And then as you go back and forth, pretty much after every action, you have the same problem again. Because if you play a card, you just use a die, but you always have the option to play any of the cards in your hand. So I find that a little draining. Whereas in Rebellion, the Rebel player allocates all of their heroes to certain actions. And it's generally more straightforward. All of the actions are more on the same category of thing. So you're not balancing very different things. But once you've decided and you've allocated them all, those are your options for that round. Then the Imperials have the advantage. They see what you've done. They do the same thing. They allocate all their actions. Then it's going back and forth doing the things you've allocated. I like that. I think that, and that leads to that interesting turn or interesting round dynamic that you talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So to me, I just enjoy the rounds more.
Yeah, in Rebellion, you kind of have to plan out your turn at the beginning and pick what actions you think you're going to want to do. And then the other player does theirs, and then it's a matter of playing those out, and you choose the order in which, you know, I'm going to move this fleet, and then I'm going to activate this mission. But you're not kind of reevaluating everything each action, which I think helps you.
But you still could be disrupted based on...
Yeah,
you might have a general plan, but you have to adapt. Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a really interesting turn structure. It's kind of a two-part thing.
And I think there's deep strategy, maybe deeper, I'm not quite ready to say, in War of the Ring with all the things that you can do. I
think they're similar.
Similar, but I just think that Rebellion is it's simpler and more streamlined. And even though you're doing, I don't know, similar kinds of things, I think that the actual turns are more interesting.
With Rebellion, the different action, like choosing the order of your actions and planning that out is more significant than in War of the Ring. Whereas most of the time, it doesn't matter if you attack with this army or attack with that army first, or if you muster here or move that. And obviously, you want to plan things out in a reasonable order, seeing such that maybe you recruit and then move the whole army out, or you play the card that helps you and then attack. But that part isn't quite as interesting, whereas Rebellion, I think there's more to be said for, I'm going to first move this fleet here, which lets me activate this mission to capture a rebel leader, or lets me blow up this planet and place loyalty somewhere else, which triggers something else. So I think there's a little bit more in that of just making the turns a bit more interesting.
If you stripped the theme entirely from both games and made it completely abstracted, Rebellion might be the better game, except for my final criticism, and that is the silly move your rebel base card. It seems so good, and it drains so much of the tension out of the game for me. Basically, one of the cards you have as the Rebellion, one of the basic cards that you're always going to have throughout the game, is that you can move the rebel base. And until the very end of the game, when a lot of the probe deck is drained and the Imperial side has really spread out their forces and has a lot of troops on a lot of planets, it's not that significant to move the base. And so all you really have to do is, if you think the Imperials might discover your base, or if you want to bluff it out or something, you just have to queue up that action with a leader in it. Yeah, it takes away a leader, but it doesn't seem that significant. And you can move the base. And then the game kind of, the whole hide and seek thing kind of resets. And I feel like it gives such an advantage to the Rebellion. It feels strategically advantageous to a very significant degree. But I think even more importantly for me, it drains a lot of the tension out of being the Rebellion, because you have the most significant card in the game, like the most powerful, at least vis-a-vis the actual end goals of the game. It's the most powerful card. In War of the Ring, you don't have anything like that. There are powerful cards that the free people can get that give them, but even like the most powerful cards, like Gandalf going into Fangorn and the Ents coming out, which is probably the most powerful card on the free people side that I've found.
It's certainly up there.
Even that only buys the Fellowship a little bit more time.
Depending on how you play it, it might not actually give you anything. It might just slow down the forces of Saruman, which maybe they've already done their job and wiped out Rohan.
In Rebellion, and I know why they have to have the card. Like, if the Imperials happen to stumble in across the base really early in the game, there needs to be a way out. But until it's that very end point of the game, you play the card, and like I said, it's the most significant card in the game. It has the biggest impact, and you just get away. And I know it's necessary, and I don't know what the solution would be to give the rebels the ability to escape in the early game, but not make it so seemingly overpowered. I don't know what that solution is.
Yeah, so
but I think it could have been done better.
Maybe, and you're right. That is the most clunky thing in the game mechanically. But so a couple thoughts. First of all, it is appropriately thematic. So in that regard, I don't think it drains the tension of being the Rebellion, because it's still a desperate affair. And yeah, you can move your base, but it's also not cheap. Like, you're most likely going to have like a really strong build up on your base. So you're probably going to be sacrificing some units to move. Second of all, I think as we played it more and gotten better, the Imperials have to adapt their strategy to the fact that the Rebellion can move their base. And I think that's fine. It also makes management of the probe deck more important.
Right, but like, we haven't found that Imperial strategy yet, right? Like, the Imperials
I think we're close.
We've played the game, like, between the three of us, 8 times? 9 times? The Imperials won the first game ever you guys played, right?
Yeah.
And then I think the third game. And then we've had a streak of 4, 5, 6 games in a row where, to me at least, it didn't even seem that close because the Rebels were able to move their base 1 or 2 times. It's like, okay, maybe it gives you like 2 more turns, but in a game that's going to last 8 to 10 turns, like that's a huge chunk of the game that it's giving you, and it's a huge advantage. And for the Imperials to kind of block that, they need to have sacrificed in opportunity cost pursuing a lot of other goals, militaristically, or blocking objectives, or doing some of their engineering things, building a Death Star. Like,
yeah,
it seems so significant that it almost blocks out entire paths for the Imperial side to
I think
pursue.
what I would say is, to me, it feels like we've pretty much explored what the Rebellion should do, and I don't think the Rebellion side is going to get that much more efficient at winning. Whereas I feel like the Imperials were still developing better strategies, so perhaps it's not as well balanced. And I am interested to hear what you think about the balance of War of the Ring. But even if it is tipped a little bit in the Rebellion's favor, I don't think it's outrageously so. And I think that moving the base is a known part of the game. The Empire knows that the Rebellion isn't going to sit still while it just waltzes in and destroys its base. It is definitely the clunkiest.
And I hope I'm proven wrong here. I really do. I hope we figure out what we're missing on the Imperial side. I know I researched this on Board Game Geek, and the consensus, there were a couple polls, and people are split pretty evenly on which side they think is better. It's just not my experience, and it's annoying me. In terms of War of the Ring balance, I've looked that up on Board Game Geek as well, and I think there's actual statistics from online play, and it's within 3 or 4 percentage points.
Nice.
So
yeah, it feels balanced to me, but I've not played it enough to have a good opinion.
I don't know what the actual split on the sides are, but it's almost always come down to a really close game. And part of that is that the game kind of, again, it's a bit more railroaded into that a bit, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I think War of the Ring is very well designed such that both tracks take about the same amount of time to do.
Yeah.
And that if you're doing anything reasonable towards achieving your goal, you're going to be within striking distance. I think I really disagree with you on Rebellion. This card is certainly powerful to move the Rebel base, but an Imperial strategy has to take that into account, and you have to have a plan to check every planet in the galaxy. So you start with 6 of them under your control. And in my, somewhat limited experience, the Rebel player usually manages to achieve about 4 to 6 points of objectives, which gives the Imperial player about 8 turns. Just from a pure math point, if they don't check anything for the first... If they check, 1 planet in the first 3 turns and just do nothing else but build up, and then for the rest of the game only move fleets, they can check the entire map in, 4 rounds.
Yeah, but
And
they have to be dropping off units on each planet to actually prevent the Rebels from just hopping on one of those planets they already checked.
Right, but when they start spreading aggressively, they get a ton of cheap production from all these little planets that they're subjugating. So it's not hard to drop off a stormtrooper or a TIE fighter on each planet and block the Rebels from going there.
True. I want to see it. I think the balance point is where I'm most likely to be wrong here.
Okay,
I don't think, even if we find the game and we're just playing the Imperials poorly and it's actually pretty balanced, I still think it takes away a lot of the tension.
One thing that's different in the games is that I think War of the Ring is more subtly tuned to where, like you said, every game is going to come down fairly close.
Which I don't mind. A lot of people will dislike
more
that.
Randomness in a game of Rebellion. I mean, in both games you're randomly drawing action cards, but I think it probably has a bigger effect of what you can do, what your strategies are in Rebellion.
Yeah.
And, just which pro cards you draw.
Yeah.
I mean, if that bothers you, that it's not a deterministic kind of experience, then you're not going to like Rebellion as well.
I think Rebellion has more variance in some of the different actions a big mission can really swing the game one way or the other, and the die roll that determines that is certainly, I would say, more weighted than anything in War of the Ring, as well as with the actions in Rebellion, because you're drawing two cards out of a deck instead of rolling, 4 to 6 or more in the Shadow player's dice. You're more likely to draw an extreme, only certain actions that maybe you can't use, whereas when you're rolling that many dice, statistically you're going to get every action at least every other turn. Plus, in War of the Ring, you have the 3 Elven Rings that are basically a free wild, a one-time use wild, which smooths out a lot of that, especially for the free peoples to keep moving the ring.
Yeah.
One or two things I will criticize about Rebellion is that the projects deck feels a bit underpowered and clunky to use, that you can check it maybe the first 1 to maybe 3 turns, but after that you're not going to have enough time to get value out of the cards you draw there, because you have to be moving fleets so much after the early game. So you check it a couple times, and if you pull something good, great, and if not, you just, you lose out on that for the game.
Yeah, it creates kind of a disconnect between
because the project
how
cards,
powerful the cards and the projects seem and how powerful they actually are. It's like in a video game, I saw a really cool video once about sound design in shooter games, and that how you have to be very careful about modeling the sounds of guns to line up with how powerful they are statistically in game. And I think the project's deck doesn't do that well, in that building the second Death Star isn't that great in the game, honestly.
Yeah, the projects deck has some of these coolest things, because you get to build the Super Star Destroyer or the second Death Star, or those are the most not the most explosive, because there's also the Death Star laser card in there that lets you actually destroy a planet, which is just a really cool thing in this game. But for how cool they are, they don't have quite the impact, because it takes so long to actually play those actions. If you draw them on turn 1 and play them on turn 2, you won't actually get that until turn 4, I think, the end of turn 4. If you start that whole process on turn 4, you might get 1 turn of use out of that the Star Destroyer or a Death Star before the end of the game, which is just not worth the actions you put into it at that point.
Yeah.
So I would say the projects deck doesn't quite feel as impactful as maybe it should be, and as the Imperial player, it's really difficult to move around the galaxy, because you can only move one space at a time instead of being able to move to, say, anything in your region or anything nearby, and you can only move each fleet once per round, which both of those I'm sure are balanced things that they've tested a bunch, but from the strategy perspective, you can easily get locked into a situation where you can't get to the rebel base. If you lose one critical fight, or you make a strategic mistake of leaving a fleet too undefended, you can get stuck with your nearest fleet is 3 spaces away, and you just can't get there in time to win the game.
Yeah, I think I can remember one game specifically where that basically happened, and it was very anticlimactic.
Yeah, because you realize, I can't get there, so the game is essentially over, even though we theoretically should play out the 2 more rounds.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not going to see it particularly often, but it can happen. It has happened to us.
One other thing I will say is, I don't know which game I think is better, but right now I'd rather play Rebellion because it's a more interesting puzzle. When I play War of the Ring, I feel like I'm going to win 80% of the time, because maybe I've played it more than you guys, because I think I've always played it among our players. I've played one of you. Mm-hmm. And so when I sit down, I pretty much always know what I want to do. Each turn is fairly straightforward.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take me long to make the decisions, whereas Rebellion especially on the Imperial side, is a puzzle that I haven't figured out yet, and I really am enjoying thinking through different strategies and how do I optimize my plan.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised that War of the Ring, it doesn't feel as, I don't know, does it feel as deep as you expect it to be? Because on the surface, War of the Ring looks like it should be a way heavier game.
Well, it is a pretty heavy game.
It's heavier than Rebellion, for sure. I think there's more to it. Although that might just be the bad rule book. But
Yes. Props to Fantasy Flight. I love their new system of the Learn to Play book and then the rules, the reference book.
oh, the reference book
It's
is
really
so
nice.
good.
It's really nice.
Yeah, they're doing well with that. I think more publishers are doing the dual book system. It's really good. Aaliyah has done a system for a long time where they do the main rules, but they have a sidebar that's kind of the reference. It does a really brief summary of all the rules. I think that's also a really good system. Anyway, I get what you're saying with War of the Ring. And that hasn't happened to me yet, probably because I'm not as good at games as you are. But
Well, I've read a bit about War of the Ring, and I have my ideas set, and I think I've won 5 times in a row now or something. And it has come down to the last turn, but I haven't felt much tension. Maybe
It's like an inevitable drive to.
I feel like I'm
the
almost
conclusion
certainly
that
going
you
to win,
expect.
and I don't know how close it's going to be, and it ends up being a little closer than I think it will be, early on in the game. But I am able to budget out the different vectors I need to approach. So if I'm playing the Shadow People, I know I need to siege down these 3 fortresses. And so by the end turns when I'm rolling 8 dice, and I know I get to attack a bunch of times, barring something completely, a super horrible roll where I roll, 8 dice that only let me play cards. I know I'm going to be able to do what I need to do, and I don't feel the tension of I might lose this until the last round or something. And even then, I usually can count out being like, well, he needs 6 actions to get the ring to the top, and he only has 5, so I have a whole round to win the game. This might be coming across as me sounding I'm so much better than everyone, but I don't mean it that way. It's just, for me, I've hit a point where I feel like I'm going to win almost, 4 to 5 times.
Okay, so in a mature group playing this game, is it possible that it will just come down to the margins, and it'll be an interesting game just played on a tiny margin of 3%? It could go either way.
That's how I feel.
I think
about the
that's
game.
how
I think-
War of the Ring will come down.
Well,
I think
and
I'm
I
just a little
enjoy
bit
that.
better than you guys at planning out my strategy right now,
Yeah.
which
I
has
feel
come
like I was really bad at the beginning with that game. You clobbered me at the first. I don't know. We got to play again because I feel fairly confident.
I will say, comparing the sides, in Rebellion, the Imperial side seems to be, after you've played it maybe once or twice, the Rebel side seems more obvious, at least to us, in terms of you just kind of, look at your actions and you pick your opportunistic,
Get
chances.
Utapau as soon as possible.
Yeah, get a planet that gives you cruisers.
It feels more tactical. Am I wrong in saying that Rebellion is more tactical? Because
I would
you're
say
dealing with what you have.
The Rebel strategy is more tactical in Rebellion, because you just need to pick the best play that turn, and it's not. You should be aware of some of the combos that you can pull off, but mostly you're just looking for where's an opportunity to get something, to get an objective this round. Whereas the Imperial player, you really need to have a tighter overall strategy, and then tune that depending on what cards you draw.
I think that's true for War of the Ring as well. I think free people have to be more adaptive to their die rolls.
This is
cards.
exactly what I was going to say. In War of the Ring, it's kind of the opposite of the Shadow People have a more clear path to victory of just you have a ton of units, you march to their strongholds, and you assault. And the free people have to be a little more reactive and have a more subtle strategy of how much do I push the ring, how much do I defend, do I spend time getting companions to go activate the different factions, and maybe even looking for specific cards more so. Whereas the Shadow People, the only card I really look for is, what's the name of the siege, the wolf siege head?
Oh, Grond.
I really, the most significant card when I'm playing the Shadow People is Grond, because it lets you pretty much just win a siege. And so if I can find that, I'll hold on to that for the climactic siege on the last turn of, taking down Minas Tirith or whatever the final fortress I need, which I think has tended to give me that boost in tempo that I need to close out the game.
Yeah.
To summarize, I think they're both great games. They're very interesting, lots of strategy. excellent thematic themes and cards and plays and actions. They're both great games. Right now, I prefer Rebellion because it's a more interesting puzzle, but you can't go wrong with either one.
Honestly, the only thing I'd maybe say, if you're picking between the two, I think that War of the Rings is a little more intimidating. So, maybe pick up Rebellion if you're worried about being able to get people to play it. Other than that, they're both great. Pick the one that you identify with the theme more. Honestly, that's what I think. I think they're both fantastic, but if you love the Star Wars universe, you're going to love the moments that come up playing this. If you love Middle-earth, you're going to love the feeling of playing that game.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the common line with when people talk about these games, is pick the one you like the theme better. Honestly, I like Star Wars better than Lord of the Rings, generally. But if you have a significant opinion one way or the other, go with the theme. I think War of the Rings is just a better game. By a fair margin. Like, again, they're both really good, and if you're interested in one of them, you should buy it. But I think it's a better game, and I think...
I feel like most of the things we've been saying come down on the side of Rebellion, though.
I wouldn't say that. I think by this point, people are going to know which experience they like better.
Yeah.
So I won't say anything else.
To give a sense of fair margin, Marc put Rebellion at 41. I don't know, but I suspect he put War of the Ring around 20 or high teens. I would probably put both of these games in the mid-teens for me, or 10 to 17-ish, 12 to somewhere in the mid-teens, I think.
Yeah, I think both. I don't know. Both would probably be in my top 25. Yeah. War of the Ring's lower for me, but I've also played it less than you guys.
Yeah. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. Again, by this point, you probably know which one you're going to prefer, the more open style of Rebellion or the more narrative style of War of the Ring.
There's no problem with getting them both.
Yeah, just get them both. So thanks for listening to the podcast. Please rate and review if you enjoyed the podcast, so it helps us get a little bit more visibility. Also, check out our website at thethoughtfulgamer.com and hit me up on Twitter or Facebook or email, and I'd love to hear from you and see what you thought about the podcast. You can always comment in the comment section below as well. Again, I'm Marc here with Matt and Orion with The Thoughtful Gamer. To conclude, quoting one of the great philosophers of our time, as he wrote in a screenplay, "Only Sith deal with absolutes."
May the Force be with you.